After working to the body's limit, she entered a car thinking it was her only chance for rest, without imagining that that mistake would completely change the course of her life. On the other side, a man accustomed to luxury and the coldness of business encounters a scene that shakes something he didn't even know still existed within him. Between exhaustion, unexpected kindness, and two opposite worlds, an unlikely connection is born that challenges everything both believed about their own realities. But when feelings begin to emerge, they will have to face deep fears, social differences, and the most difficult doubt of all. Is this real or just a passing moment? Before discovering how this unexpected encounter can transform two lives forever, leave your like and subscribe for more exciting stories like this. The box didn't weigh much. That was what hurt the most. Camila Resende had spent 11 months inside that building of glass and concrete on Rua Henrique Schaumann in Pinheiros, and all she had to show for it fit into a cardboard box the size of an encyclopedia. A small cactus she bought at the fair when she still believed she would stay, a cell phone charger, 2 pencils and an eraser, the sketchbook that no one ever asked to see. She went down in the elevator with the box in her arms and found no familiar face along the way. The lobby of Plural Communication was all clad in smoked mirrors and white marble floors. Beautiful, cold, impersonal, exactly like the people who worked there. The receptionist, a young woman with her hair tied back and a headset in her ear, didn't even look up when Camilla passed through the turnstile for the last time. 11 months of daily presence, and she was invisible, even to the woman who controlled the building's entrance. Outside, the July wind in São Paulo was a direct blow to the face. Camilla stood on the sidewalk and stared at the building's facade, as if expecting someone to appear at the window to give at least a wave. No one appeared. The flow of pedestrians on Henrique Schaumann moved forward, as if she were part of the scenery, one more moving piece in the city that never stopped. A young woman with a cardboard box was landscape, not a person. She had understood this in the worst possible way. She was 28 years old, had a portfolio she considered honest and technical experience, accumulated over 3 years of working as a freelancer. She wasn't inexperienced. She had her own clients before entering Plural, had won a regional graphic design award at 24, and knew more about visual identity and editorial language than half of the seniors who passed her in the hallways without even noticing her existence. But existing within Plural was an art she had never mastered, and it wasn't for lack of effort. The job had reached her through a recommendation from an old colleague. It was a good opportunity, he had said, a complete redesign project of the company's editorial line. They are going to need someone with your eye, with your sensitivity. She accepted without negotiating much, too anxious to belong to something bigger than her home office in Pompeia. She made the first mistake before even starting. She should have asked why the position was temporary. She should have asked who would look after her growth within the project. She should have asked many things. She asked none. In the following months she delivered. She always delivered and delivered well. When the briefing arrived at 10 o'clock on a Friday night, she opened her notebook and started without complaining. When the client changed direction in the middle of a project, she turned everything over and presented 3 alternatives where only one had been requested. When the art director, Priscilla, presented Camilla's deliverables to the client as if they were her own, Camilla watched from the back chair and swallowed the discomfort. She was a freelancer. She had no table power. It was better not to create friction. She had told herself it was a matter of time, that someone would notice. That silent effort had a value that would eventually be recognized by someone who mattered. She spent 11 months repeating this phrase like a mantra before sleeping, and in the 11th month, when the contract simply wasn't renewed, she understood that she had been just a temporary convenience for people who never had the intention of truly seeing her. The termination email arrived the previous afternoon. No prior meeting, no conversation, no feedback, no farewell coffee. 3 lines signed by the HR department she barely knew personally, thanking her for the collaboration and informing her that the project had been successfully concluded. She stared at the screen for a long time before starting to put things in the box. Successfully. The word had sounded like involuntary irony. The project concluded successfully thanks to her work, and she would be discarded in the same way any support material was discarded when the campaign ended. Now, on the sidewalk, with the cactus balanced on top of her other belongings, Camilla tried to remember why she had believed so much in that place. She couldn't identify a single specific moment. It was something vague, built on thin layers of hope and ingenuity. The hope that talent would speak for itself. The ingenuity of thinking that corporate environments recognized silence as a virtue and not as a fragility to be exploited. She began to walk toward Rua Fradique Coutinho, where she had parked the car. Villa Madalena was in the background, the neighborhood's graffitied walls visible from where she was, and there was something almost ironic in the contrast. On one side, all that spontaneous, colorful, urgent art exploding from the walls as if it could no longer contain itself. On the other, her, with a cardboard box, leaving a communication company where her creativity had been silently consumed for almost an entire year, returned blank, without credit, without a trace. She wasn't angry. She was feeling something much worse than anger. She was feeling the heavy and opaque certainty that she had done everything right, and yet it hadn't been enough. This was the part that hurt in a way that had no easy name, in a way that stayed quiet inside the chest and settled in slowly, like a leak that only appears when it's already too late. She adjusted the box in her arms and quickened her pace. She didn't want to cry on the sidewalk, not in front of that building that never knew what it had. She would save that for when she got home, when she closed the door and could collapse in peace without anyone seeing. That was the privilege of the invisible. At least the collapse was all yours. That was when she heard the voice, firm but not aggressive, somewhat surprised, as if the person themselves didn't expect to be there or didn't expect to say what they were saying. Camilla. She stopped. She turned slowly, like someone who doesn't want to look like they care but already feels the rhythm of their heart change involuntarily. On the other side of the sidewalk, coming toward her with long strides and a serious expression, was Renato Drummond. She knew him by name from the photo on the institutional website and from the one time he crossed the open space while everyone pretended to work with more intensity than usual. Renato Drummond was the founder of Plural Communication. Not the executive director on duty, not the manager hired to be the face. The founder. The man who had built that company from scratch, who appeared on lists of the most influential businessmen in Brazilian communication, and who, according to constant office rumors, was incapable of remembering the name of anyone below the senior management level. He had come out of the building in a grey overcoat and without any assistant by his side, no cell phone in hand, without that numbed expression of someone who is always on the way to somewhere more important. He was looking at her, directly at her, and he had called her by name. Camilla stood still on the sidewalk, the box in her arms, the cactus slightly tilted, watching him approach and absolutely not knowing what to do with that unexpected information. Renato Drummond was 52 years old and had the posture of someone who never needed to ask permission to enter a room. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair already graying at the temples, and brown eyes that, up close, had a kind of attention that seemed uncommon in someone of his position. Camilla had learned in her months inside Plural that men at the top of structures like that rarely truly looked at the people around them. They stared, they evaluated, but they didn't look. He was looking. He stopped 2 meters from her and shoved his hands into the pockets of his overcoat with a gesture that seemed more like hesitation than elegance. "Can I ask you for a few minutes?" he said. The voice was low, direct, without the condescending performance she expected. "I know it's not the ideal moment." Camilla looked at the box in her own arms and then at him. There was something absurd about the scene, the most powerful man in the company chasing a discarded freelancer on the sidewalk of Henrique Schaumann on a cold July afternoon. She considered saying she didn't have time. She considered saying she had already said everything she had to say, even though she had never said anything. She considered simply continuing to walk. "All right," she said instead. Her voice came out firmer than she expected. He indicated with a light gesture a coffee shop a few meters away, the kind of place with a varnished wood facade and plants in the window that abounded in that part of Pinheiros. Camilla entered carrying the box, and he didn't offer help, which she interpreted curiously as instinctive respect. She didn't need help with the box. It was too light. They sat at a table in the back, away from the window. Renato ordered 2 coffees without asking if she wanted one, and she didn't correct him because she actually did. The barista knew them, at least by socio-economic level, greeted Renato with a respectful nod, and ignored Camilla with the same efficiency that everyone else had ignored her that day. "I found out this morning," said Renato without preamble, while they waited for the order, "that you had left, that the contract had not been renewed." Camilla didn't answer. She waited. "I went to check the work that was delivered in the last few months on the editorial line, the complete redesign." He paused. "Your name does not appear on any internal document as responsible. Priscilla's appears." "I know," said Camilla. "I didn't know," he said. And there was something in that sentence that sounded like an uncomfortable confession, not a justification. "I assumed that the process of valuing freelancers was being managed correctly. I assumed that whoever delivered was recognized. I was wrong to assume." The coffee arrived. Camilla wrapped her fingers around the small cup and felt the heat pass through her palms. Outside, a bus passed noisily through the street, and the sound muffled when the door closed. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. The question was honest, not aggressive. Renato was silent for a second. He seemed to be choosing his words with the same care with which she imagined he chose business strategies. But there was something different in the way he was sitting, without the usual shield of the agenda or the assistant by his side. He was just there in a neighborhood coffee shop, with the coffee cooling in front of him. "Because you deserved at least a conversation," he said, "and because I was the one who allowed a structure to exist where someone with your work could spend 11 months invisible. That's not Priscilla's problem, it's my problem. She took advantage of a gap I left open." Camilla looked at him for a long moment. There were 2 possible versions of that man. The first was the one everyone described, the calculating businessman who appeared to put out image fires when necessary. The second was the one she was seeing at that moment, which could be real or could be a very well-executed performance. She still didn't know which was which. "And what changes now?" she asked. "The contract has already ended." "Nothing changes regarding the contract," he said, with an honesty that strangely she preferred to an easy promise. "But there is something I can do, if you accept." He took from the inside pocket of his overcoat a simple card without a logo, with only a name and a handwritten telephone number. He placed it on the table and pushed it with 2 fingers toward her. "Beatriz Fonseca," Camilla read aloud. "Creative director. She founded her own studio 6 years ago in Moema. She is considered by many professionals in the field the best in Brazil at what she does." Renato took the cup and drank the coffee in one gulp. "She and I have a long-standing relationship, not business. Mutual respect. If I call her this afternoon and say there is a designer she needs to meet, she will answer." Camilla looked at the card. The paper was thick, textured, the kind that costs a lot without needing to announce it. Beatriz Fonseca's name was written with a fountain pen, and there was something in that detail that made her think the card was genuine, not a formality. "Why would you do this?" she asked, looking up at him. "Because I made a mistake," he said simply, "and because this is the kind of mistake that, if I can, I prefer not to leave uncorrected." Camilla stared at the card on the table and tried to find the angle. She looked for the trap, the disguised condescension, the gesture that would be more about his conscience than about her. It's possible she would have found some of that if she looked hard enough, but what she found first was something else. She found the image of herself leaving the building with that light box, invisible to everyone, and thought that any door that opened from that moment on would be a door that didn't exist an hour ago. She picked up the card. "All right," she said, for the second time that day, but this time the phrase sounded different. It sounded like a beginning, not a resignation. Renato nodded. He didn't smile, didn't vibrate, didn't turn it into a moment bigger than it was. He just nodded, with the expression of someone who is trying to do the right thing and knows that doing the right thing is just the minimum. They finished their coffee almost in silence. When Camilla stood up to go, he remained seated, as if he needed one more moment in that quiet place before returning to the world where he was always the most powerful man in the room. She left, carrying the box and the card. The cactus was slightly slumped to the side. She straightened it with her thumb and walked toward the car without looking back, with something new and still nameless moving inside her chest. As she drove back to Pompeia, the card on the passenger seat, Camilla tried to process what had happened. She had reached the end of that day expecting to carry only the weight of failure and had left with something she didn't expect to find. The possibility that someone, even if too late for the contract, had taken the trouble to see. Was it little? Was it much? She didn't know yet. But it was different from the invisibility she had carried for the last 11 months, and that for now was enough for her not to throw the card away. She stopped at the traffic light on Cardeal Arcoverde and looked at the name written there, Beatriz Fonseca. She asked herself if she would call, if she would have the courage to schedule a conversation with a professional of that level based on a gesture of reparation from a man she barely knew. She asked if her portfolio was good enough. She asked if she was good enough. The light turned green. Camilla engaged first gear and decided she would answer those questions at home, calmly, after placing the cactus near the window where it caught the sun. The message arrived the next day at 9 in the morning, while Camilla was still in pajamas with coffee in hand, and the cactus already positioned on the windowsill where the morning sun hit. "Hi, Camilla. I'm Beatriz Fonseca. Renato told me about you. I have an opening tomorrow at 10 in the morning if you want to talk. It's in Moema on Alameda dos Maracatins. Let me know." No long introduction. No excessive formality. A message that said exactly what it needed to say and expected the same in return. Camilla stared at the text for longer than she should have. Then she typed, "Great, I'll be there." She spent the rest of that day organizing her portfolio. It wasn't the first time she prepared material for an interview, but it was the first time in almost a year that she did it, with a feeling that wasn't exactly anxiety, but something like real urgency. She reviewed every project, every typographic choice, every grid system she had built. She deleted 3 pieces that no longer represented her. She added screenshots of Plural's editorial redesign with the original files she had methodically saved on an external hard drive, each version dated and named with precision. Priscilla might have presented the work as her own in front of the client, but the file's metadata told a different story. She went to sleep early. She woke up before the alarm. Beatriz Fonseca's studio was on the 3rd floor of a discreet building on Alameda dos Maracatins in Moema, with an exposed brick facade and a small sign at the entrance that said only BF Estudio in sans serif letters. Nothing that caught attention, nothing that needed to catch attention. Camilla took the stairs because the elevator had a sliding wooden door that looked like it belonged in a museum, and she didn't want to risk it. And she reached the 3rd floor with her notebook under her arm and her heart at a rhythm she preferred not to examine too closely. The reception was small and very well resolved. Whitewashed walls, an aged leather armchair, a solid wood table with a single plant in the corner. No TV, no ambient music. Without that performative energy of companies that need to convince visitors they are creative before any conversation. The place had confidence in its own skin. The assistant, a young woman with thin-rimmed glasses, announced her and pointed to the room at the back. Beatriz Fonseca was 45 years old and had the kind of presence that didn't depend on scenery. She was standing when Camilla entered, next to a table covered with paper samples and references pinned to a corkboard on the wall. She was a woman of medium height, short grey hair, dark eyes with a direct expression, and a smile that appeared quickly and disappeared quickly. The kind that isn't coldness, it's objectivity. "Camilla." She extended her hand. Firm grip. "Sit down." They sat. Beatrice didn't ask for the portfolio immediately. Instead, she asked a direct question. "Tell me about a project you did and no one knows it was you." Camilla was silent for a second. It was an unexpected question, and at the same time, it was exactly the right question. Because that was the center of everything. She had an entire list of answers to that question. She opened the notebook. She showed the editorial redesign of Plural, starting with the diagnosis she had made even before receiving the first formal briefing, when she identified on her own the inconsistencies in the company's visual language and proposed a cohesive system that no one had asked for. She showed the dated files. She showed the 3 generations of versions, each revision documented. She showed the final version that had been presented to the client during the launch event of the new identity, where Priscilla went up on stage and Camilla watched from home via streaming. Beatrice listened to everything without interrupting. She asked specific and precise questions. She asked about the typographic choices, about the logic of the color system, about how she had resolved the adaptation for different formats without losing coherence. Each question revealed the technical level of the one asking. Each of Camilla's answers was received with real attention. Then Beatrice leaned back in her chair and was silent for a moment. "You are very good," she said, not as a social compliment, as a technical evaluation. "And you know it, but you are still afraid to occupy the space that your work deserves. That will be a problem if you don't solve it." Camilla felt something move in her chest. It wasn't discomfort, it was recognition. Someone had named exactly the thing she carried. "I'm working on it," she said. "Good." Beatrice joined her hands on the table. "I have an open position here. It's not senior immediately, but the path is fast for those who deliver. We work with medium and large brands, projects that last from 3 months to 2 years, and every designer here has real authorship over what they produce. Name on the project, voice in presentations, shared decisions." She paused. "It's different from what you lived." "Very different," Camilla agreed. "Send me the terms you need by tomorrow. I'll send you the proposal later today." The meeting lasted 42 minutes. When Camilla left the studio and went down the stairs, the Moema sun was different from the Pinheiro sun of 2 days ago, not physically, but there was something in it that seemed less hostile. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, her hand on the iron railing, breathing the air that smelled like bakery coffee and bus smoke, and allowed the emotion she had suppressed for the last 48 hours to appear for a few seconds. She didn't cry, but almost. She took out her cell phone and held it in her hand for a long moment before deciding what to do. There were 2 messages from friends asking how she was, a message from her mother asking to call when she had time, and a notification from a professional network. Renato Drummond had viewed her profile at 8:47 in the morning, even before the meeting began. She put her cell phone in her pocket without replying to anything yet. She walked to the car, thinking that in less than 48 hours the world had rearranged itself in a way she still couldn't completely map out. And that, at the center of this rearrangement, there were 2 people who had seen different things in her, but who had seen. This was new, and new was enough for her to continue. Beatrice's proposal arrived at 4 in the afternoon, as promised. Camilla opened it on her notebook, on the balcony table with the cactus beside her, and the sun already low over the roofs of Pompeia. She read it carefully. She reread it. They were fair, clear terms, without traps hidden between the lines. There was a specific clause about authorial credit on projects that made her stop and reread 3 times. It was a simple clause, almost obvious, but it was the first time in a long time she saw a company formally commit to that. She replied accepting the terms. She sent the email before she had time to reconsider, before letting fear occupy the space that the decision had occupied. She stared at the screen for a moment after the email was sent, with the strange feeling of someone who has just taken a step without knowing exactly where their foot will land. But there was something firm down there. She felt it. She closed the notebook. She watered the cactus. She called her mother. The first few weeks at BFA Studio were like learning to walk on ground that seemed firm but that she still tested with every step, with the caution of someone who had been deceived by the floor before. The team was small. 6 designers, 2 strategists, 1 content producer, and Beatrice, who moved between everyone with a silent efficiency and without performative hierarchy. Meetings started on time and ended when there was something to finish. Projects were discussed with everyone involved present. Decisions were explained. Mistakes were treated as data, not as moral failure. Camilla observed all this with a mixture of relief and distrust that she herself recognized as a consequence of the previous 11 months. She kept waiting for the trap that didn't come, waiting for the moment when someone would turn and say that in practice things worked differently than on paper. The moment didn't arrive. In the second week, she received her first project with real autonomy, a São Paulo gastronomy brand, a new restaurant in Higienópolis that needed a complete visual identity and communication system for social networks. Beatriz introduced her to the client personally. "This is Camila Rezende, the designer responsible for the project. She will lead the entire process with you." Small detail, huge impact. Camila presented the initial diagnosis alone in front of the client, without anyone by her side to validate or steal the scene. Her voice trembled for the first 2 minutes. Then it didn't tremble anymore. The client asked questions, and she answered with the confidence of someone who knew the work she had done. At the end of the meeting, the client said he was excited about the direction. Beatriz, who had observed in silence from the back chair, crossed paths with her in the hallway afterward and said only, "Well done." 2 words that were worth more than any certificate. Outside of work, life followed a new rhythm. She had gone back to going out on weekends, meeting friends in Vila Madalena, going to the morning fair without feeling like she was stealing time from some urgent delivery. There was something of recovery in this routine, as if the body needed to remember it existed beyond the notebook and deadlines. It was on a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after starting at the studio, that Renato Drummond reappeared. She was in a bookstore on Rua Aspicuelta, looking at the photography and design section, with a book about Saul Bass in her hands, when she heard footsteps stop beside her. She turned, and he was there, with an architecture book under his arm, and an expression that mixed genuine surprise with something she couldn't immediately name. "Camila." "Mr. Drummond." "Renato," he corrected, with a slight discomfort in the use of the formal address. "We are outside the corporate environment." She almost smiled. "Renato." They stood side by side in the section for a moment, which is always a slightly strange situation between 2 people who know each other but don't know each other well, in a small and silent space that requires a type of conversation that the corporate environment doesn't train anyone to have. "How is the studio?" he asked. The question was natural, but there was an attention in it that went beyond social kindness. "Better than I expected," she said honestly. "Beatriz is exactly what you said she was." "She always was," he said. "I worked with her before she set up her own business. She left because she couldn't stand structures that stifled authorship." He paused briefly. "I should have paid more attention to that at the time." Camila looked at him from the side. There was a self-criticism in him that appeared naturally, without being asked for, and that she found difficult to reconcile with the image of the distant businessman she had built during the months inside Plural. It was as if 2 Renatos existed, and she was still discovering which of them was the most real. "Do you always come here?" she asked. "Almost every Saturday," he said. "It's the only place where no one sends me a message expecting an immediate response. Terrible signal, reasonable stack of books." There was a lightness in the sentence that was different from everything she associated with him until then. "And you?" "First time," she admitted. "I was avoiding bookstores while working at Plural. It felt like I didn't deserve to enter pleasant places while I was unhappy at work." He was silent for a second. There was something in that silence that was real consideration, not discomfort. "That is a very cruel logic toward yourself," he said. "I know I'm unlearning it." They left the bookstore at the same time without planning it, and stood on the sidewalk of Aspicuelta with the afternoon sun hitting from the side, the kind of light that makes São Paulo look gentler than it is. He carried the architecture book in a paper bag, and she carried the Saul Bass she had decided to buy on impulse. "There's a place near here that makes the best pão de queijo I've ever eaten outside of Minas," he said, with a casualness that had been tested before being said, she felt. "If you're not in a hurry." Camila considered it. There was an implicit border in the conversation being negotiated there, and she knew it. He was the former owner of the company where she had been invisible. There was a power asymmetry that still existed, even if he was wearing sneakers in a bookstore on a Saturday. But there was also the conversation in the coffee shop, the card, the months she had spent wondering if anyone would ever see her. And there was the simple fact that he had called her by name before anything else. "Pão de queijo I don't refuse," she said. They walked to the end of the street. He didn't pick up his cell phone a single time. The bakery had an old white tile facade, the kind that resists time and renovations through the sheer stubbornness of an attached owner. There were small tables on the sidewalk and a smell that reached you before the door. Renato ordered the pain de queijo with the familiarity of a regular and a black coffee for himself, waited for her to order hers, and when they sat down, the sun had already turned orange over the roofs. They talked about things that weren't work. She asked about the architecture book. He said he had started to take an interest in the subject when he renovated an old apartment in Higienopolis, and realized he understood much more about visual communication than about physical space, and that had bothered him enough to turn into a book. She told him that the design award she had won at 24 was for an urban signage project that was never implemented, and that she still kept the model in her living room closet as a reminder that sometimes the best work is what stays between you and what could have been. He listened to this last part with an attention that was different from the attention in meetings. It was the attention of someone who is saving what they hear. They stayed on the sidewalk until the sun disappeared completely. When she said she needed to go, he nodded without insisting, and there was a restraint in that gesture that was more respectful than most things people usually do when they don't want someone to leave. "It was good," he said simply, as she picked up the bag with the book. "It was," she agreed. She walked to the car with the Saul Bass under her arm, and the feeling that the day had been longer and richer than the previous ones, the way good days usually are when you stop forbidding yourself from living them. She didn't reply to the messages until she got home, and when she did, there was a smile she hadn't planned. The Higienopolis restaurant project was delivered 6 weeks after the start, with the presentation conducted entirely by Camilla. She arrived at the meeting room with the material printed on real paper samples, because she had learned that visual identity seen on a screen and visual identity held in the hand are completely different experiences, and that the second was where people really decided if they believed in the brand. The client approved on the same day. No revisions. No, let's see how the partner reacts. A clean approval that, according to Beatrice later, was rarer than any designer liked to admit. Camilla left the meeting with the specific lightness of someone who had just proven something to themselves. Not to the client, not to Beatrice, not to anyone who had ignored her before. To herself. That was the part that changed the weight of things. In the following weeks, other projects arrived. An independent publisher in Pinheiros that needed a cohesive cover system for a new literary collection. A cultural institute in Itaim Bibi that wanted to reposition its visual communication without losing its already built identity. A cosmetics brand in Moma that was growing and needed a language that grew along with it. Each project was different. Each one required a type of listening. She was learning to refine, the kind of listening that goes beyond the briefing and reaches the unsaid whys. Beatrice observed from afar and intervened surgically, at the right moment, with the question that opened the path Camilla hadn't seen yet. It wasn't tutoring. It was collaboration between peers with a difference in experience, and Camilla learned more in the first 2 months at BF Studio than in the entire 11 months at Plural. With Renato, the messages had started in a discreet way. An article about design he had read and thought she would have an opinion on, a question about an exhibition that was showing at MASP, a comment about the architecture book he had finished. She replied with the same casualness, and there was something pleasant in that rhythm, an exchange that didn't demand anything immediate nor anything beyond what it was at that moment. But it was inevitable that things would become more than that. The problem with real connections is that they grow in the spaces between words, and when you realize it, they have already occupied a considerable space. On a Sunday in August, he invited her for a walk in Ibirapuera Park. Simple, direct, straightforward. She said yes with the same simplicity. The park was full, as always on August Sundays when the sun appears after weeks of cold. They walked by the lake with the speed of those who have no hurry and no destination. And there was something she noticed throughout the walk. He didn't use the conversation to present himself. He didn't list achievements, didn't reinforce his own importance, didn't turn every exchange into a subtle demonstration of power that men in his position sometimes do without realizing it. He asked. He listened. And when he spoke of himself, he spoke with an honesty that included mistakes, not just results. When Plural turned 10, he said at one point, while they circled the lake, I gave an interview in which I said that the secret of success was attention to people. All the press loved the phrase. He paused. 3 months later, you entered the building to work on an 11-month project, and I didn't know you existed. Camilla walked a few more steps before answering. You knew when it mattered, she said. I knew late. But you knew. She looked at the lake for a moment. There are people who never know. He was silent for a while. It was the kind of silence that people fill with empty talk when they don't know what to do with a truth said with simplicity. He didn't fill it. Can I ask you something? He said later. You can. Why did you accept the coffee that day? It was a question she had asked herself more than once. The honest answer had several layers, and she chose the truest one. Because you called my name, she said. Not hey or excuse me or a wave. My name. And most of the people who passed me in that building that day didn't know I had one. He stared at her for a second with an expression she couldn't completely classify. There was recognition there, and something deeper than recognition. I knew, he said. I knew before the last day. She stopped walking without realizing it. What? I had read about the award you won. When your contract was approved by management, the document passed through my office. I saw the name and recognized it. I assumed that with that record, you would be integrated into the permanent staff eventually. He stopped too, turned to her with the expression of someone who is saying something that needed to have been said before. I didn't follow up to see if that happened. I failed by not following up. Camilla stayed with that information for a moment. He had known who she was. He had read about her work before any conversation, and he had assumed that someone would take care of the rest, when it should have been him to take care of it. Does this change anything? He asked, with a vulnerability she didn't expect from a man like him. She considered it. The sun was high and hot, and children were screaming near the lake, and there were pigeons walking around them with the typical authority of those who live in a public park and owe no explanation to anyone. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I prefer knowing to not knowing. They continued walking, and when they left the park later, there was something between them that wasn't there when they entered, a kind of mutual understanding that the conversation had reached a level where both people were being real. That was rare, and they both knew it. He dropped her off at the Consolação subway entrance because she had said she preferred to take the subway, which was true, but was also a way to have a moment alone to process what had happened. He didn't question or insist on taking her by car, which she noted internally as one more piece of data in that process of slowly discovering who he was outside the corporate frame. On the subway back to Pompeia, she kept her headphones in but without music, just looking at the reflection of the dark tunnel window as the train ran. She was trying to understand what she felt, and what she felt was a complicated mixture of things that didn't yet have full names. There was the attraction, which would be useless to deny. There was the caution, which was healthy and necessary. There was the asymmetry between them that she needed to take seriously, because it didn't disappear just because a man was good at talking in a park. And there was, along with all that, a new and firm feeling that she was finding someone real, not an edited version of someone for external consumption. The question was what to do with it, and she still didn't have the answer, but she was, for the first time in a long time, willing to find out. She got home, watered the cactus, and stood at the window looking at the roofs of Pompeia until the stars appeared in the dark August sky. The complication arrived, as complications usually arrive, at the moment when things were good enough that you started to believe they could keep being so. Camilla was in the studio on a Thursday in September when Beatrice entered the meeting room with an expression she hadn't seen before. It wasn't the expression of project urgency, nor that of deadline adjustment. It was something else, heavier. "I need to talk to you," Beatrice said, closing the door behind her. They sat down. Beatrice crossed her arms on the table and looked at her for a second before starting. "I received a call yesterday from a reliable source in the market." Pause. "Saying that Plural is preparing to launch a positioning campaign based on the editorial redesign you did, signed internally without any attribution to you." Camilla was silent. "This is nothing new in terms of what has already happened," Beatrice continued, "but there is a difference now. The project will be submitted for a National Design Award, with authorship attributed to Priscilla and the internal team. If it wins, the authorship is publicly recorded forever." The silence that followed had a specific quality, the kind of silence that isn't empty, but is full of things that haven't yet turned into words. "I have the files," Camilla said finally. "Everything dated, metadata, versions, revision history." "I know," said Beatrice, "and that's what needs to be used now. Not in an aggressive way, not as a public fight, but as a formal record." She leaned back slightly. "Camilla, you spent 11 months producing work that was presented as someone else's. You have documentation that proves otherwise. You can, if you want, send the authorship dossier to the award organization before their final submission." It was a decision simple in logic and huge in everything else. Camilla spent the next afternoon gathering the files. She opened the external hard drive and organized everything chronologically: the initial diagnosis, the 3 generations of concept, the email approvals where her address appeared as the sender, the meeting minutes where the client replied to her directly. It was a story of authorship told in files, a story that had existed all along, even when no one had wanted to tell it. What she hadn't predicted was the message that arrived the same night. It was from Renato. It wasn't a daily message, it was long, careful, and had clearly been written with attention. He had found out, through channels she didn't try to identify, that there was an authorship issue arising regarding Plural's redesign. He said he had found out and didn't want to fail to get in touch. He said that what had happened to her work was an injustice he recognized he had made possible by omission, and that if she needed any support regarding the documentation or the process, he would support her. No conditions, no intermediaries, and at the end, with an honesty she felt pierce the screen. "I know there is an obvious complication in the fact that I initiated contact with you that way, and I know that everything that came after needs to be evaluated by you with open eyes about who I am and what I did and what I failed to do. I'm not asking for anything, I'm saying I'm here if you need me, and I say this independently of anything else between us." Camilla read the message 3 times. The moment had arrived that she had avoided examining directly. The question of whether what was developing between her and Renato was genuine or was, in some way she didn't want to see, an extension of the problem. A man who had treated her as invisible, who had approached after the mistake, who was being good and attentive but who carried the structural weight of what had happened. Was it possible to separate the 2 things? Was it desirable? She didn't reply that night. She left the phone on the table and went to organize the files, because there was a concrete decision to make that depended only on her, and she needed to make it without the emotional noise of the rest contaminating the clarity of what was right. The next day, she sent the authorship dossier to the award organization by registered email, with a copy to Beatrice. She did it alone, without asking anyone for help, because it was her work and her authorship, and she was capable of defending both things without needing a man by her side, regardless of who that man was. After that, only after, she replied to Renato's message. She wrote, "Thank you for the message. I took care of what needed to be taken care of. Regarding the rest, I needed time to think. Can I call you tomorrow?" The reply arrived in 2 minutes. "You can." Camilla closed the notebook and looked at the cactus that had doubled in size since it arrived from the Plural building. There was something in that discreet and constant growth that seemed to say something about resilience that didn't need an audience. She turned off the bedroom light. Tomorrow was a day that would have to be faced with total presence, and total presence required rest. She fell asleep before midnight, for the first time in weeks, with the strange and good feeling that she had done what needed to be done, and that the rest was a story still being written. The call the next morning lasted 40 minutes. Camilla kept walking around the apartment while talking, because it was the kind of conversation she couldn't have standing still. He listened more than he spoke, which was the right thing to do. She said what she needed to say with a clarity she herself hadn't expected to find at that moment. She said she had liked who he was outside the corporate environment, that the conversations had been real to her, and she believed they had been real to him too. She said there was an asymmetry between them that she needed to name directly, so that it could coexist with honesty, not to end what was being built, but because pretending it didn't exist was the kind of dishonesty she no longer knew how to practice. "I know it exists," he said, "and I agree it needs to be named." "That's what I'm doing now," she said. "Then we are communicating like adults," he said, with a lightness she recognized as genuine. "That seems like a much better start than most stories I know." She stopped in the middle of the room. She looked at the cactus on the sill. She thought of everything that had happened since that afternoon she left the building with a light box and a heavy heart. How much had changed, how much she herself had changed. "It seems so to me too," she said, and there was a smile in the sentence that he couldn't see but that she felt. When she hung up, she stood for a moment with the phone in her hand, and the silence of the apartment was different from the previous silences. It was the silence of a place where someone was becoming who they were meant to be. Then she went to have coffee. She had projects to deliver and a story that wasn't finished yet. That same week, Beatrice called her for a conversation Camilla hadn't expected. It wasn't about a project or a deadline. It was about a proposal the studio was receiving from a large company to develop the entire visual communication system for a new line of products. An 18-month job with a broad scope. Beatrice wanted Camilla to lead the account. "You have the profile," Beatrice said, direct as always, "and you have the maturity that this client will demand." 2 months ago, Camilla had left a building with a light box and the certainty that she was replaceable. Now the person whose opinion she most respected in the market was saying she was the right person for the studio's most important project. "I accept," she said without hesitating. Beatrice nodded with that quick smile that disappeared before turning into a compliment. Camilla left the room knowing that something was consolidating inside her, more lasting than any position. It was the conviction that she belonged in the place where she was, not because someone had placed her there, but because she had arrived by merit and stayed by choice. The response from the award organization arrived on a Monday in October, 3 weeks after the dossier was sent. Camilla was in the studio, working on the covers for the Pinheiros publisher, when the email arrived. It was formal, polite, and said exactly what she had expected it to say. The documentation had been received, the authorship verification process would be initiated, and Plural's submission would be suspended until the conclusion of the analysis. No promises, no guarantees, just the recognition that there was an issue to be investigated. It was enough. She closed the email, went back to the covers and worked until 7 at night, with a concentration that had a different quality from previous concentrations. It was the concentration of someone who had put something in the right place and could now look forward without that lateral weight that distracts you without you noticing. Beatrice found out about the email when Camilla left her room at the end of the day. She was silent for a moment and then said something Camilla kept. "Do you know what changes when you defend your work on your own?" Beatrice said. "You come to know that you are capable of it, and that knowledge doesn't leave you afterward." Camilla thought about that on her way home. She thought about the version of herself that had left the Plural building with a box in her arms and the silent conviction that silent effort would eventually be recognized. There was something naive in that version, but there was nothing wrong. Naivety wasn't the problem. The problem was having confused silence with patience and invisibility with humility. She had learned the difference in the worst way and then in the best way, and now she knew both by heart. With Renato, things had found a rhythm she hadn't expected to find. Natural, without urgency, without that rush to define categories that people usually feel when something is becoming something. They met on weekends with the regularity of those who want to be in the same place and don't need a formal invitation to admit it. Sometimes dinner, sometimes walking, sometimes just sitting at a bar in Consolação with 2 glasses of wine and a conversation that started in one place and ended in a completely different place. He had told her about the marriage that had lasted 8 years and ended when both realized they had built an excellent partnership, but not a real intimacy. He told it with the objectivity of someone who processed that properly, without resentment, but without false romanticism. She had listened and recognized in something in that story the same honesty he applied to everything else. She had told him about the 4-year boyfriend who had ended the relationship over the phone on the day she won the design award, saying he didn't see himself being able to keep up with the pace of someone who put work above all else. There was something cruel and revealing in that timing. Renato had listened with the same attention he used for everything, and then said that someone who leaves when you win was not someone who was truly with you. It was a simple conclusion, but said at the right moment it had the weight of a certainty. On a Sunday in October, he invited her to see the apartment he was renovating in Higienopolis. She accepted with a clear awareness of what that meant in terms of proximity, and with an equally clear awareness that she was ready for that level of proximity. The apartment was in a 1950s building with large windows overlooking the treetops of the avenue. It was in the middle of the renovation, walls open in some points, new floor laid, but still without final furniture. There were material samples everywhere, and an improvised work table with a notebook and a cup of cold coffee on it. "It's chaotic," he said, with a smile that had self-awareness. "It's a project in progress," she said. "I understand that." They walked through the rooms while he explained what he was planning for each space. She kept asking questions about the choices, about the logic of the materials, about why he had decided to keep certain original features of the building instead of modernizing everything. And while he answered, she realized that the way he thought about the apartment was the same way he thought about everything, with attention to what already existed before deciding what to modify. "You think like a designer," she said. He looked at her with an expression of surprise that clearly wasn't performative. "I had never thought of it that way." "It's a compliment," she said. He was silent for a second, and in that silence was that specific quality of someone who is deciding whether to do something or not, and who decided to do it. When he approached her, it was slowly, the kind of approach that gives time for the other person to choose. She didn't move away. And when he said her name for the second time since they met, with the same weight as when he called on the sidewalk of Henrike Schaumann, she realized that some things repeat because they need to be heard more than once before being completely received. What happened next was something she hadn't planned, and that, for that very reason, was more real than anything planned could have been. She left the apartment later with the same calm as someone who made a choice and has no reason to regret it. The night was cold, and the trees of Higienopolis were large and silent under the avenue lights, and she walked to the car with her coat on her arm and the feeling that she had reached a point in the story that was genuinely new, not a repetition of anything she had lived before. That was the kind of new that was worth it. The following days had a different texture from the previous ones. It wasn't euphoria, which is unstable by nature. It was something quieter and firmer, the kind of feeling that settles in when you are living something that is real and recognize it while it happens, without needing to wait for the perspective of the future to be sure. In the studio, projects continued to arrive and be delivered. The Pinheiros publisher had approved the cover system with enthusiasm she rarely saw in editorial clients, who are usually discerning and contained. The Cultural Institute in Itaim Bibi had asked to expand the scope of the project. The cosmetics brand had requested a second meeting to talk about a possible long-term partnership. Beatrice had observed all this with the expression of someone who is confirming something she already knew. "You are occupying the space," she said one afternoon in passing, without stopping to make a scene of it. It was just an observation, an accurate one. Camilla had kept that phrase the same way she had kept the previous one. There was a collection of things Beatrice said that she intended to take for the rest of her professional life, not as rules, but as orientation marks. The kind of thing you hear from the right person at the right moment, and that changes the way you view your own work forever. At the end of that week, a notification arrived from a professional network, an invitation to a round table on authorship and attribution in graphic design, organized by an industry association. The invitation was for her to speak as a guest. The theme was exactly what she had lived, and her name appeared first on the list of participants. She accepted without hesitation, for the same reason she had sent the dossier to the award, because it was her work and her story, and she had learned that occupying the space you deserve is not arrogance. It is responsibility. She sent a message to Renato telling him. He replied with 2 words, "Makes sense." And there was in those 2 words all the kind of recognition that doesn't need adornment to arrive. The round table was in November, on a Wednesday afternoon. in a cultural space in Itaim Bibi that Camilla had, by coincidence, helped to visually reposition weeks before. There was a kind of circle in that which she hadn't planned, but which she recognized as the kind of thing that happens when you are in the right place. The room was smaller than she had imagined, which surprised her positively. 50 people, maybe 60, most of them designers and communication professionals, some students with notebooks open on their laps. The panel had 4 participants besides her: an award-winning art director, a copyright specialist, a university professor, and a commercial photographer who had gone through a situation similar to hers. The moderator was a journalist specialized in creative culture who had read about her case in the documents that circulated in the sector after the dossier was sent. She had prepared what she would say. She had written it in a notebook, crossed it out, rewritten it, slept with the text in her head, and woke up with the certainty that she was going to speak the way she spoke when she was being honest, which was the only way that worked. When it was her turn to open, she said exactly that. She said she had spent 11 months producing work that was presented with another name, and that she had remained silent out of a mixture of fear, ingenuity, and the mistaken belief that talent alone was enough protection. She said that invisibility in the workplace was not just an emotional issue, it was an issue of record, of authorship, of rights. And she said that the first thing that changed when she began to change was having accepted that occupying her own space was not a favor she did for herself. It was an obligation. The room went quiet in a way she recognized as real attention. The questions that followed went directly to the point. Someone asked about the documentation process. Someone asked about how to deal with the discomfort of confronting hierarchical structures. Someone asked how she had found the courage to send the dossier. For the last question, she stopped for a second before answering. "It wasn't courage," she said. "It was clarity. When you have the files, when you have the history, when you have the proof of what you did, sending the dossier is not an act of bravery. It is simply doing what the data indicates needs to be done." A pause. The courage was before. It was in the 11 months in which I continued to deliver despite everything. That indeed demanded something of me that I'm not sure I would repeat in the same way. Someone in the back of the room noted that sentence. She saw the movement and felt something settle inside her, the kind of settling that happens when you say something that was true even before it turned into words. After the event, while the room dissolved into smaller conversations, a young designer, she couldn't have been more than 22, came to her with a notebook clutched to her chest and said she had gone through a similar situation in her first internship and that she had thought it was her fault. Camilla stayed with her for 15 minutes, listening and answering with the honesty the situation required. When the young woman left, there was something different in her posture. That was worth more than any award. Renato was in the audience. She had seen him when she entered, sitting discreetly in the last chairs, without an assistant, without prominence, like someone who went because they wanted to be there and didn't need anyone to know. They met outside after most people had left. "You were very good," he said, and there was in the sentence the simplicity of an honest evaluation without exaggeration. "You didn't need to come," she said without accusation, just as a statement. "I know," he said. "I came because I wanted to." They stood on the Itaim Bibi sidewalk while the Wednesday night traffic passed noisily by, and there was a comfortable silence between them, the kind that only exists when two people don't need to fill the space to justify each other's presence. It was then that he said what she didn't expect. "There's one thing I needed to tell you," he said, with a seriousness that was different from his usual seriousness. "And it needed to be now after what you did today." She looked at him. "The design award you won at 24, he said, "the urban signage project." She was silent, waiting. "I was one of the judges," he paused. "I voted for your project. I didn't know your name at the time. I saw the work number and the quality of what was before me. I voted because it was the best." Another silence. "When your contract appeared on my desk at Plural years later, and I recognized the history, it wasn't the first time I had come across your work. It was the second." Camilla stood completely still for a second. There was something in that revelation that went beyond surprise. It was the feeling that the story had an architecture she hadn't seen while she was inside it. connections that existed long before any sidewalk in Pinheiros or coffee shop or thick paper card. Her work had reached him before her name, and her name had reached him after. And yet in the middle of all that, there had been 11 months of invisibility that shouldn't have happened. "Why are you telling me now?" she asked with a quiet voice. "Because today you said that your work speaks for itself when you allow it to speak," he said. "And I wanted you to know that it is true, that it was true before you met me, before anything between us, before Plural and after Plural." He looked at her directly. "You were recognized for your work before anything else, and you will continue to be." She stayed with that for a long moment. The traffic continued. The Itaim Bibi lights were yellow and white on the wet asphalt from a drizzle that had started without warning. And then she understood, in a way that was complete and without gaps, that that day, that moment on the sidewalk, was the exact opposite of that other day when she had left an invisible building. It was the moment when all the pieces reached the place they had been trying to reach all along. She took a deep breath. She looked at him, and she said what was true. "Thank you for telling me." He nodded, and then, with a simplicity that was the mark of everything he did when it was real, he held out his hand to her. She took it, and they stayed like that for a moment on the damp Itaim Bibi sidewalk, while São Paulo continued around them with the usual indifference of the big city, which doesn't stop to celebrate anything but which, if you pay attention, carries within itself all stories at the same time. Camilla thought of the cactus that had left Plural in a cardboard box and was now on the Pompeia windowsill, growing slowly and without needing applause. She thought of the 11 months of invisible work that, she discovered now, had been seen much earlier than she imagined, in a contest by a judge who didn't know her name but had recognized what she was capable of doing. She thought of the young designer with the notebook clutched to her chest who had left with her posture a little more open. There was a continuity between all these things that she hadn't planned, but that she recognized as real, and there was something deeply comforting in knowing that honest work leaves traces even when you can't see them. The drizzle got stronger. He asked if she wanted dinner. She said she did. They went. 6 months later, BF Studio won the award that Plural had tried to compete for. The editorial redesign project was credited to Camilla Resende, the responsible designer, as the documentation had proven during the verification process. There was no public drama, no social media statements, none of those confrontations that stories usually demand to seem satisfying. There was a process, a verification, a conclusion, and a small heavy trophy that sat on Camilla's desk in the studio, next to a paper sample from the Pinheiros publisher and a sketch of the next project she was still developing. Beatrice was the one who told her about the result. She entered her room one March morning with the same firm step as always and placed the printed notification email on the table. "Your name," Beatrice said, and left. Camilla stared at the paper for a long time. She had expected that moment to be bigger, louder, more conclusive somehow, but what she felt was something different, quieter and deeper than relief or victory. It was the kind of feeling that has no easy name but is essentially the recognition that the story reached where it needed to reach, and that the path there had been part of it in a way that made it more real. She had changed in those 6 months, not in a radical way, not in a way that was visible from the outside as a revolution. She had changed the way people change when they go through things that demand they become more than they were, from the inside out, layer by layer, without alarm. She presented projects with her name. She asked questions she wouldn't have asked before for fear of appearing insecure. She had accepted an invitation to give a lecture at a design school in February and had discovered she liked talking about the creative process to those who were starting out, that there was something deeply significant in passing on what she had learned in the worst way and in the best. With Renato, things had settled into a form she hadn't tried to rush or define before being ready. They were together in the sense that mattered. They were present for each other with honesty and without ceremony. He had finished the renovation of the Higienopolis apartment, and there was a room he described in a message as with enough light to work, and she had understood what that meant without him needing to be more direct. The cardboard box was kept in the Pompeia closet. She hadn't thrown it away. She had kept it as one keeps any object that represents a turning point, not with nostalgia, but with the kind of respect owed to the moments that change the direction of a story. The cactus had grown so much, she had needed to change its pot. There was in that a metaphor so obvious that she smiled to herself when she realized it, one Sunday morning, while she put the cactus in the new pot with fresh soil, her hands dirty, the sun hitting the Pompeia window. Sometimes the truest metaphors are the simplest ones. She washed her hands, made coffee, opened her notebook, and began working on the project that would come next. There was much ahead, and there was finally all the clarity that she was in the right place to face it. End of story. Dear person who has made it this far, thank you for walking along with Camila from the Cold Pinheiro sidewalk to this Sunday morning in Pompeia. If her story touched something in you, if you've ever felt invisible in a place that should see you, or if you simply believe that honest talent deserves to get where it needs to go, then you know exactly why these stories need to exist. Every day we bring narratives like this here on the channel. Stories of real people, true emotions, and the twists and turns that real life knows all too well. If you haven't subscribed yet, this is the moment. Press the button now, turn on the bell, and come be part of this community that chooses to feel for real. Leave in the comments what marked you most in Camila's journey. We read everything. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story today, share it. Sometimes the right story arrives at the right time, just as the right name was spoken on a sidewalk in July. We'll see you in the next one.